Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Goyette, and I am the director of Mesa Petroglyph Project.
And I'm Ethan Ortega, the site manager for Los Luceros Historic Site.
In 2009, Mesa Prieta began a lecture series locally, one that we've continued to run until this day. But tonight, we are really excited to announce our new partnership with Los Luceros Historic Site.
We're very excited about this partnership as well. Shortly after becoming a state historic site, we started discussing creating our own lecture series. But fortunately, there was this amazing lecture series already here, so it was a no-brainer to team up.
And tonight, we're lucky enough that Ethan is willing to host our first lecture of the year.
Yeah, so we'll have many lecturers throughout the series, all the way into the fall, but I'm lucky enough to get to kick this new series off, and I'll be sharing with you all some of our recent research into the archives of Los Luceros Historic Site.
You can stay in touch with us by following our newsletters or following us on social media. You'll get announcements about all of our upcoming lectures and events and news.
And thank you so much for joining us for this kickoff event. And please bear with us as this is our first virtual lecture, but it should begin shortly. Thank you. All right, so I understand the microphone wasn't working. Let's try that. Okay, so I think we've got the microphones figured out. All right, so hello everyone. To reiterate, my name is Ethan Ortega and I am the site manager for Los Luceros Historic Site. Thank you for joining us and thank you for being patient while we figure out this first virtual lecture. And it looks like it's working, so we're good to go. So tonight we're going to be exploring the history of Los Luceros Historic Site. And I began as the manager last fall, and we've heard lots of interesting stories about the site's history. We've heard about the site being the first courthouse for Rio Arriba County, as well as there being hangings that happened here and people sentenced to death. We've even heard stories about Oñate, the person who led the 1598 European settlement colonial expedition here, to have buried his treasure. So, you know, there's lots of interesting stories. And as we go through tonight, we're going to talk about some of these that might be true and some of them that might not be. And so let's go ahead and see if we can bring up the presentation. All right. And so, this is an interesting way to give a talk because usually I can ask people questions and make it pretty interactive. But right now I'm talking to nobody. At the end of this talk, I will check out Facebook for questions and try to answer some of the questions people might have. I saw the first question was, why are you presenting this if it happened in March 28th of 2019? And so that was when the site was designated as a state historic site. And so we're a little ways away from that, but we're taking this opportunity to share the history of the property. And so some of you might not know, where is Los Luceros historic site? Los Luceros is located in northern New Mexico. We're about 45 miles north of Santa Fe, and we sit along the Rio Grande River. So we have about a half a mile of riverfront property here. And then who owns Los Luceros historic site? So currently, Los Luceros historic site is owned by the state of New Mexico. And then it's managed by the Department of Cultural Affairs. We're actually the largest state entity for cultural programs and resources in the country. And then the site is specifically managed by New Mexico Historic Sites, which manage about 8 properties throughout the state. And so the history of Los Luceros often starts at the Spanish entrada and the Spanish settlement of the area. But people living here actually goes way, way back. And so here on this slide, you can see some of the oldest artifacts that have been found in the area here. And so these things are from what's called the Archaic period. And this is kind of a transition. People have been living in New Mexico for the past about 13,000 years or so. There were people here towards the end of the Ice Age actually hunting really big animals like mammoths and things. And as the climate starts to change, people start to adapt. And so here in this area, we find spear points from this time period, and then gradually they become arrowheads as the things people are hunting become smaller and as life changes. And so during this period, people also start to practice cultivating crops. So things like corn, other kinds of plants like that. And as that becomes really popular, people start to become a little bit more sedentary. And so when people start to become more sedentary, they have time to do lots of other things. And this is an example from Mesa Prieta, which sits just on the other side of the river from us. And these are some petroglyphs from the Archaic period, from that period that we were talking about, where people were in transition, going from moving around the landscape a lot to starting to become a little bit more sedentary. And here are some of the examples from that time period. There's lots and lots of examples here on the side of the Mesa. And most of these petroglyphs are carved into basalt. It's a large area with volcanic rocks. And so as time continues, people start to adopt agriculture even more and become more and more sedentary and start to establish villages. It's often misrepresented that the first settlements here were when the Europeans arrived, or that the Spanish settled New Mexico. But that's not true. So beginning around 1250 AD, so almost 800 years ago, people were starting to build large villages here in this area. And so the diagram that you see here is actually Fioge Pueblo, which is located very, very close to Los Luceros historic site. And when Fioge Pueblo was occupied, the people that were living there had built almost 400 rooms. It was a very, very large village. And it's estimated that the population of Fioge Pueblo could have been up to maybe 200 people at any given time. And so there's lots of signs along with the village itself. There's lots of signs of what people were doing and how they were living here on the landscape. And so one of the things that we see around are potential field house sites. So they were living in this village up on a bluff above the floodplain, but a lot of agriculture was going on along the rivers and places that naturally got water whenever the river flooded. And so this is an example of what a field house might have looked like, maybe a 1 or 2 room structure that might have been out where the agricultural fields are. Interestingly enough, the hacienda, which is one of the main structures here at Los Luceros historic site, some of the lower foundations of one part of the building have what's called puddled adobe or coursed adobe. And that's basically where the wall is made using mud balls, and they would be stacked up to a certain level and then let that dry and continue until you got to the desired height. That type of construction and architecture was really common and widespread throughout the American Southwest until the arrival of Europeans. And from that point forward, molded bricks start to become popular and more in use. And so the fact that our hacienda here has some foundations that are made out of coursed or puddled adobe suggests that the hacienda could have started maybe as a field house. And as the European settlers moved into the area, they might have built upon that structure. Other things that we see around is pottery. There's lots of pottery here in this area. And so we have no doubt that the people of Fiyoge were using the property to grow crops and to do other things. We find lots of what's called bandelier black on white or biscuitware. This is the main painted type of pottery that was used in this area, and it's black and white. And you can see there's lots of really beautiful designs on here. We do have one complete bowl that has been recovered from the property, and we have that on display in our visitor center. But we see lots of pieces of pottery elsewhere whenever we're walking around, conducting agricultural activities, and so on. Also, a kind of living reminder of the people that used to live here are the Sandhill cranes. So we all love to see the Sandhill cranes migrating in the winter, coming down from southern Colorado all the way down to southern New Mexico and back up. And really, the reason why we have cranes in such a large number and that travel up and down the Rio Grande is heavily thanks to the people that were farming during this time period. And so the Pueblo people all up and down the Rio Grande were practicing really intensive corn agriculture. And so there's all of this extra food that's growing along the river, and the birds notice that. And so some recent archaeological studies suggest that the reason that there's so many migratory birds that fly through this route is because of the crops and because of that access to food. And so the Pueblo people were performing agriculture on such an intense level that it actually increased the population of migratory birds, and it changed their migratory route as well. And we can see this in the archaeological record by an increase in the number of these types of animals that are represented, whether they're being used for food or ceremony. And so Fiyoge Pueblo was really, really active from about 1250 AD all the way until the arrival of the Europeans. And so the first European settlers of this area came with the Oñate Expedition in 1598. There had been lots of other European explorers previously, but the Oñate Expedition were the first European people that came to this area specifically to set up a colony. And so in conducting research, we start to realize a little bit more about these people. And we often kind of, give blanket terms to things. And so, we call this the first European settlement of New Mexico. But really, once we start to look into who these people actually were, there's a lot of people that actually had diverse genetics and diverse cultural and ethnic histories. And so it wasn't just people that came from Europe, traveled here to settle. It's people that were, had European and indigenous ancestry and cultural traits, and they were bringing that up with them. So it was really much more complex than we typically make it out. That being said, Oñate and his soldiers definitely were not good guys. They did a lot to harm the local indigenous people during this time, started a lot of conflict, And of course, they were coming and moving in and taking up resources that the people that were already living here needed to survive. And so it wasn't an easy time at all. And when Oñate came, he brought about 129 colonists with him, 10 Franciscan friars, and about 7,000 head of livestock. Can you imagine how much food it would take to keep 7,000 head of livestock alive? They were probably just ravaging the landscape here. And so Oñate sets up their first settlement at San Juan de los Caballeros. And then shortly after that, they create another settlement called San Gabriel, and that was at the confluence of the Chama and the Rio Grande rivers. Not too long after that, Governor Pedro de Peralta, he comes to the area and he decides that it's really not the best place to set up the first settlement. And so they actually move a majority of the colonists to what is now Santa Fe, which has remained our capital since then. But that doesn't negate the impact that the European settlers had here in this area. And one of those things was people at villages like Fioge leaving. And so, of course, we don't have any photographs of the people of Fioge, and there's been very, very limited archaeological research done on the site. And so I'm going to share with you an oral history that was recorded here at Los Luceros Historic Site and transcribed about what happened to the people of Fioge whenever the Europeans arrived in the area. And I'll be illustrating it with historic images from Okeawinge Pueblo, which is our closest Pueblo village that's still active and one of our stakeholders as well. And so Fioge Pueblo was active until after the arrival of Europeans. And according to their oral history, they did not like what was going on with the conflict that was brought in, the pressure to convert and change their way of life, which, I mean, who would? And so the people of Fioge Pueblo actually decided to collectively move away, and they set out west, and all but one person left. There was one old woman that chose to stay there because she was born there, and she didn't think she could make the trip, and so she wanted to stay and live the rest of her life at Fioge Pueblo, her home. And then the rest of the village continued on, and they got to Jemez, the Jemez region, the Jemez Pueblos, and they decided that that wasn't really the place for them. There was a big drought going on at the time, and the Jemez people kind of took it as a bad sign. And so the people of Fioge kept moving west and eventually made it to the Hopi Mesas. And so when after people had left, the old woman that was there at Fioge started to hear a baby cry. And so she started running around, and like I said, we know that there are 350 to 400 rooms in that village. And she was running around looking for this baby. And eventually she found him, and she raised him as if he were her own. And eventually he kind of sets out on a quest to go find his family. So he travels westward after he completes a series of tasks, and finally makes it out to the Hopi Mesas, where he finds his sisters collecting water near a spring. And so from there, it's believed that this individual actually married a Hopi woman and then moved back into the Tewa land, and kind of came back into New Mexico. And so it's really neat that we do have some of these oral histories and these oral traditions from Fioge Pueblo that have been going on for centuries. And it's also important for us to remember the indigenous heritage of this area. Like I said earlier, it's so often that histories and tours here in northern New Mexico start with the Oñate Expedition in 1598. And of course, we know that the history goes back deeper for thousands of years. So this kind of leads us to the next part of time. So the Europeans are here, and then the Pueblo Revolt happens in 1698, and that's another bit of local history. Pope, who is a very charismatic individual from Okeawinge, actually works to unite all of the Pueblos together to revolt against the European settlers. And since most of the Pueblos speak different languages, they did this through a method of tying knots in ropes. And they distributed these knotted ropes around to all the Pueblos, and they were untying one each day. And the plan was for the last day to revolt against the Spanish and push them out of the area. But the Spanish caught word, and so they actually sent runners out a day early and were still able to catch the Spanish off guard. And so this revolt happened, and it was not an easy thing. It was a bloody force on both sides to push the Europeans out. And then they were gone for about 12 years. Now, during this time, a lot more people and a lot more Pueblo people were heading to the Hopi Mesas as well, and heading to more remote areas to get away. They knew that the Spanish would come back and would come back with force. And that happened. And so what is called the reconquest of New Mexico, but really the forcible reclamation of New Mexico by European settlers, happened in 1693 and was led by Diego de Vargas. And so that kind of sets the stage for the next chapter of Los Luceros history. The next person to kind of come on stage is Sebastian Martin Serano. And he is a descendant of some of the original European settlers of San Gabriel. His great-grandparents were on the Oñate Expedition. And so Sebastian Martin Serano, he was a captain. He helped with the reclamation of New Mexico by the Europeans. And he was awarded, he and his brothers, with one of the largest land grants in northern New Mexico. So he was given 50,000 acres in 1705. And that stretched all the way from Oqueowingue Pueblo to Velarde in the north, and then all the way east to Truchas. So this map kind of shows you the north to south area of his land grant, and then continued all the way to the Truchas Mountains. So he had married a woman named Michelle Lujan, and they settled here in this area. It's not really known exactly where the heart of their rancho was. We believe that it was somewhere close to Los Luceros, if it wasn't right here where we are today. And they had many kids. The land grant was in a very fertile area, so they were very successful. And eventually, when Sebastian Martin was ready to start developing the land, he actually created the main acequia that runs through the area. And this is actually one of the largest and oldest acequias in northern New Mexico too. And so for people that aren't familiar with acequias, these are water ditches that come off of the Rio Grande and then attach back to it. And then there's a whole network of lateral ditches that come off of this to water orchards and crops and so on. And so, for example, here at Los Luceros, we have almost 8 miles of lateral ditches that come off of this main ditch. And it's pretty amazing that this acequia is still running from 1705 or around that time period. Now, this system of irrigation is actually brought by the Spanish from North Africa. So when the people of North Africa influenced Spain, it's something that stuck, and then it was something that was brought by them to the New World as well. And when Sebastian dug this, we say that he dug it, but really, as we dive into the records, it looks like he had basically indentured servants from Oqueowingue dig the ditch. And in exchange for them digging it, he was awarding them land. That's what the documents say, but really, Sebastian was giving land back to the indigenous people of Oqueowingue Pueblo that was taken from them by the Spanish government. And so this land grant, since it was one of the biggest ones, like the name has stuck, and it's had a huge impact all the way until today. And so this is a newspaper clipping that's from I believe 1917, and it's talking about kind of the last time that his land grant as a big chunk was sold. And so this will kind of intersect with some of the history that we talk about in a little bit, and you can see that Los Luceros is even mentioned in here. But it had a big impact on the area and on the history of northern New Mexico. And so Sebastian Martin passed away before his wife, and she was the one who got to decide who inherited this vast amount of land, as well as some material culture, as well as some objects that they had owned. And so it's really interesting during the colonial period because people don't have a lot of stuff. They may have a lot of land and a lot of animals, but they don't have a lot of things. And so some of the things that were left whenever Maria Lujan passed away to their children was a pan, a spoon, a bell, and a gun. And the bell was from their chapel that was at the place where they had set up their homestead. And so the chapel is really an interesting thing, and it kind of ties into our history today. And so one of the reasons that we feel so firmly that the Los Luceros historic site was kind of the center of the Sebastian Martin land grant and where they might have been living is because we have a capilla, we have a little chapel that's here on the property. And this chapel just happens to be the exact same dimensions as the chapel that was built by the Martin family. Now, in terms of architecture, the capilla that's here was rebuilt and designed in the style of the mid-1800s, the territorial style. But just the fact that the dimensions and the descriptions are almost exact compared to what was built in the 1700s, as well as the direction that it faces, is really, really compelling that this might have at least been the site of the church or the capilla that was built by the Martin family. And so that kind of ends the time of the Martin family here in this area. And the Martin family is still around. It's not a name that you think you hear of very often, but it actually is. So Martinez is the kind of derivative of that name. And over the centuries, the EZ was added to the end of that. And so for the next several decades, it was still really an area full of conflict, and there was a lot of push and pull from the indigenous communities and the European descended communities. And so this whole area becomes depopulated between the 1748 and 1750 because there was so much conflict going on that it really wasn't a safe place for anyone to live. And so for a few years, people just took off and went to much larger communities. And after that, that kind of sets the stage for our next set of family, and the family that's the namesake of the property, the Lucero family. But there's a second part of that name that we don't often hear, and it's Lucero de Godoy. And so Lucero is a word that comes from the word luz, which is light. So often Lucero in this area is interpreted as morning star or the morning star. Godoy is a name that comes from Spain and from kind of royal Spain, and it's a name that was given to people that were great supporters of the king. So really a royalist. And so these names come together in Mexico City. And that's kind of the first documentation of the Lucero de Godoy family in the New World. And they were royalists. There's several letters that we have from this family during this time period about them doing anything that in their power to support the King of Spain and to further his mission. And so the Lucero family comes up into what is now New Mexico, and they weren't necessarily a wealthy family to begin with. What they started doing was they started marrying smart. And so the Lucero family started marrying in to lots of bigger families with land grants and with money and livestock. And so that's how they become part of this area. They married into the Martin family, and that brings the Lucero name in the 1700s here to this area. and that name starts to stick. And so Los Luceros, and this is their family crest. What's really interesting at Mesa Prieta, there's actually a few petroglyphs that are from this time period that are of lions and are believed to be made from Europeans. And so I would not be surprised at all if it were some of the Lucero descendants that were adding their part of the story into the sides of the Mesa as well. And so when we start to speak about Los Luceros during this time period, and Plaza de los Luceros, it wasn't like a plaza or a community that we think of today. So, when you think of a plaza, you might think of the plaza in Santa Fe or downtown or in Old Town Albuquerque. This community really stretched along the Rio Grande. So it went from Alcalde all the way for 10, 15 miles, all the way up to Velarde. And that was the Plaza de los Luceros. And so it consisted of lots of family members, lots of buildings, but the thing that they all shared in common was that they were practicing agriculture here along the Rio Grande. And so the Lucero family is here for quite a long time, and like I said, long enough for that name to stick, and it stayed here. And they actually continued living on what is now the historic site until the early 1900s. But during that time, the land started to be separated, and other families started to come in, and it started to become segmented. And so kind of the next set of interesting characters here that we're able to tie specifically to the property are Elias and Maria Clark. And so Elias Clark, he was an immigrant from Ireland. And when he was about 25 years old, he ends up in this part of New Mexico. And he married a woman named Maria Lucero. And so her father was Julian Lucero, and he ends up starting towards the end of his life, he ends up deeding what is now Los Luceros historic site to Elias and Maria. And the reason that he says that he deeds it to Elias is because of how in love they are. And so, in the actual documents where they transfer the property, Julian says, "It's in consideration of the love and affection that he bears for my daughter," which I think is really neat. And so Elias was a very interesting character. He was a county clerk or a county probate clerk. And so one of his roles was actually to transport the territorial votes of New Mexico that were cast in Rio Arriba County to Santa Fe to be counted. And so not once, but multiple times, he was either captured or confronted, or the votes were stolen while he was transporting them from this area down to Santa Fe. And so we have several court documents that have him in court, accusing people of stealing the votes. And so, who knows what was really going on there? But the one thing we do know is that for at least, 2 or 3 elections, the people of Rio Arriba's votes weren't counted and were stolen or misplaced or hidden. And so over the course of this time, they're also running a store, and there's lots of other ways that they're drawing money in. As Julian becomes older, he keeps deeding more and more land to this couple. And so he deeds an orchard that he says is south of the main house. And this is one of the historic orchards that we have photographs of from the early 1900s. It was still in existence through that time. Elias also was a person that was interested in trying new things. And so we have several documents, including a report from the governor and an article in a local newspaper that say he was the first person to bring the crop alfalfa to the Southwest, and that he had it transported all the way from Europe and brought here, the seeds, and then they grew it here. which is super fascinating. And if you walk around the property now, we still have fields and fields of alfalfa. It's a prolific crop throughout the Southwest. And it's neat to think that this property may have been the first place that kind of brought that in, which changed, raising animals here forever. And so he also hosted a lot of people. Since he was involved with the court system, he would host different kinds of government groups that were coming through to do different types of surveys, or people that were traveling between Santa Fe and Taos. And we have a lot of accounts of people actually staying the night here. And they would sleep in the Gran Sala. They noted that Maria Clark would actually eat dinner with them. And so during this time period in New Mexico, when you had guests, it was really uncommon for the woman of the house to sit and have dinner with the guests. But she did that, which I thought was really interesting. And then after dinner, they would have some kind of entertainment in the Gran Sala, and then they would roll out mattresses on the ground for people to sleep on. And so that was a pretty traditional experience during territorial New Mexico. We also believe that this is likely the time period when the hacienda, which you can see here in the photograph, had its second story added on and some major renovations were going on. Before, the hacienda probably started out as a single-story structure with rooms in a big square and an open courtyard in the middle. And this was pretty typical of the colonial period and the Reconquest period. But during the territorial period, things were a little safer. Things were there was a little bit more stuff starting to come in terms of building materials, and so the floor plan is laid out and becomes symmetrical, and then a wraparound porch is created, which almost makes it look like a plantation. But when you look at the details, the building is still made out of adobe, and then the details around the windows are Romanesque. They're from the territorial period. And so it starts to kind of change the look and the feel of the area. And then Elias and Maria, they have one child. They have one daughter named Eliza Clark. And Eliza, she marries a man named Luis Ortiz. And they're the next ones to inherit this area and inherit the property. And so they're the first set of people that we have really firm documentation to that lived in the hacienda as we see it today in this two-story structure. Back then, there was no stairway in the middle. You had to go up the stairs on the outside and then go into any room that you wanted. These two were really interesting characters as well. And so Luis Ortiz, he actually became a member of the House of Representatives for the territory of New Mexico. And he participated in the 25th territorial legislature. And he served on 3 different committees. I'm not sure how many committees they had at the time, but these seemed pretty important. He served on roads and ditches, agriculture and manufacture, and railroads. And then, he also served a single 2-year term as the Rio Arriba County Sheriff. And by this point, the county seat has moved from the Los Luceros area to Tierra Amarilla, where it is today. But prior to that, really since colonial times, the county seat of Rio Arriba, which used to be everything north of La Bajada on I-25, it was the county seat. And so, there was never really a big courthouse. And so that's one of the things that we had always heard was, this was the county seat and the hacienda was the courthouse. And so it actually turns out there was no official courthouse until the courthouse was built in Tierra Amarilla. Before that, the court would rent rooms out of people's houses to try people. And we actually have a lot of those records that are still around. And the majority of people whose homes were being rented for court were the Lucero family and the Ortiz family. And so that was going on here in this area. And so while it was not a formal courthouse, it's very possible that several of the structures here on the property were used as courtrooms or trial rooms during this time period. It's also said that either Elias Clark or Luis Ortiz were judges, and that the storehouse here next to the hacienda was a jail, and people were hung outside of it. And so to kind of start debunking those, they both worked with the courts and were clerks or probates, but there's no record of any of the people that lived here at Los Luceros ever being a judge. And then, in terms of the building being used as a jail, it was kind of the Wild West. So, I'm sure that there were people at times held against their will, but there was never any official jail building until the courthouse was built in Tierra Amarilla. And so that's another kind of thing that we hear all the time. And there's a concrete room inside of the storehouse next to the hacienda, which often gets interpreted as the jail cell. But we now know that the concrete was added in the 1900s, so long after this time. And then some research that our state historian had conducted shows that death by hangings and really like capital punishment during the territorial and early American period in New Mexico was actually very, very uncommon. The most common punishment for any type of crime was people working in exchange for whatever amount that they might owe. And so, kind of debunking three things there in a row, we were probably used as courtrooms multiple times, but we weren't an official courthouse. We didn't have a jail. If people were held against their will, it wasn't documented here. And probably no one was put to death by hanging. There were only two accounts in the whole territorial history of Rio Arriba County where people were put to death by hanging, and both of those accounts happened in Alcalde, so a community that's a few miles south of us. So just kind of knocking off some of those false stories that have stuck to the site here. So some other interesting things about Luis and Eliza is they were involved in a lot of different types of businesses. And this, just real quick, is one of the notes that we know about that was actually from Luis Ortiz as sheriff. So this is one of his letterheads, which I think is super cool and was very likely written out of the hacienda here. The other paper that I have here to show you is one that comes directly from here at Los Luceros, and we can zoom in there on the header of his stationery, and it says Luis M. Ortiz, dealer in all kinds of fruits and vegetables, orchards and gardens at Los Luceros. Isn't that neat? So, this is a real direct connection to the site and to kind of what the site is all about. It's a fertile area. And so, agriculture is really the reason why people have been here for the last 800 years. And also, I just really love the header on his stationery. It's very interesting and very, very beautiful. So this kind of takes us to the next part of the site's history. And around 1912, Luis starts to try and sell portions of his property off. They had, inherited and purchased a lot of buildings and a lot of acreage, and it was a lot for them to do. And so they tried to sell it a couple times, and those fell through to some really interesting characters. Any of these sections really could be its own whole lecture on these individuals and their impact on the site and their impact on New Mexico history. But just kind of hitting some of the main points, the next shift was really to the site becoming part of a dude ranch. And so in 1912, he starts trying to sell the property, and then a few years later, he meets Richard and Caroline Faffel, and they're some of the people that started the San Gabriel Dude Ranch. which is just a few miles south of Los Luceros historic site, or was a few miles south. And so this dude ranch was set up by these individuals, and basically it catered to wealthy people from the East Coast coming out and pretending to be cowboys for a little while the real ranch was actually managed by people that knew how to conduct ranch work, knew how to ride a horse, and then they would take people on expeditions all around the Southwest. Whenever Mary Wheelwright was living at Los Luceros, she would use staff from the San Gabriel Dude Ranch, and she actually went on an expedition from Los Luceros all the way to the Grand Canyon and back. And from their reminiscence of that trip, they said that there wasn't a single fence that they had to cross or road from here to there, which is pretty incredible to think about. So now we have San Gabriel Dude Ranch here catering to wealthy people from the East Coast and bringing them in for what they think of as an authentic New Mexico experience. This is something that's really being marketed at the time by the railroad industry, as to get out and find your true self in the American Southwest. Go back to a simpler time, this kind of thing. But, as we start to research this, a lot of the experiences that these people had were very fabricated and very planned. And this is one of the ads from the San Gabriel Ranch trying to get people to come out. And so this is one of the things that first lures Mary Cabot Wheelwright out to the property. But before that, like I said, the Lucero family was still here, and even though the property had become segmented, there were still families that were living here. And by the time the San Gabriel Dude Ranch was going, Ursula and Abel Lucero were building a brand new house here at Los Luceros. And so this is a photograph of their house. It's still here today. We call it the Victorian Cottage because it was probably built around the turn of the century, and it was made from a catalog. So they ordered the plans out of a catalog, but then built it with local materials. So it's an adobe building. The wood was all made locally with New Mexico embellishments, but it was probably bought out of a catalog similar to like Sears and Roebuck. And so this family was really the last Lucero family to live here on the property. Of course, the Lucero family is still around us and thriving today. And when we're open, we do get lots of Lucero descendants that come and share stories and pictures. And we're hoping that once we're open again to start an oral history project back up in which we were collecting lots of memories of this place. But here we have Abel and Ursula, and they, it was the 1920s were coming around, and agriculture in northern New Mexico was really not doing well. Basically, if you had money, you could do experimental agriculture and become successful. But, if you couldn't, afford the newest inventions or the newest seeds, everyone was struggling at this time. And so these Luceros move up to Colorado and are in search of work in Colorado, and then eventually move elsewhere to California and so on. But this is the family that's still here whenever Mary Wheelwright starts to purchase up the area around their home. And so Mary was a visitor of the San Gabriel Dude Ranch, and she was brought to what is now Los Luceros historic site by Carol Faffel, and she was here on horseback. And this area, was actually being used by the San Gabriel Dude Ranch to pasture the horses for the ranch. And they really didn't pay any attention to the buildings during this time period. And so a lot of the buildings, including the hacienda, fell into disrepair. And when Mary Wheelwright came through, she just had to have it. She fell in love with the property, and as a woman who owned an island in Maine, a mansion in Boston, and a home in Majorca, she could pretty much get what she wanted. And so she purchased a small acreage of the property including the hacienda, and then took off. And this began basically a decade of renovations that were overseen by Caroline Stanley Fathfull. And so she started making the hacienda livable again for people to be in there. And so we have some interesting photographs, and I didn't put one in the slide, but when shortly after Mary Wheelwright bought the property, one of the entire walls of the hacienda collapsed, and we have this photograph with a donkey standing on top of it, and the donkey could basically walk up the pile of the wall into the second story. So it took a lot of work to restore, and one of the things that happened during this time period was they removed all of the territorial designs from the house, and they rebuilt it or refaced it in what is called Pueblo Revival style. And at the same time period, it was happening at the Palace of the Governors, as well as other buildings throughout the state. It was kind of this idealized version of what New Mexico should look like, according to these individuals. And so there's lots of territorial things that are hidden within the house still, including the house's layout, but the facade of it looks more like Pueblo Revival now. And then some other things were brought in, like electricity, indoor restrooms. Before that, it was all outhouses, as well as a kitchen was brought inside of the house. And so this kind of shows you what Los Luceros, the hacienda, looks like today. We have the house decorated in a way that you would have seen it during the time that Mary Wheelwright would have been living there. In fact, in this photograph, the painting that you see on the wall is a painting of Mary Wheelwright as a child. But the reason that we have it decorated in that style is because that's what the architecture of the home looks like. Now, as we move forward, we're hoping to bring in other influences into different rooms in the house, including we have one room that we'd like to set up to be a traditional Hispanic room that might have looked like what the Lucero family was living in, or the Martin family, so that it's not just only representing the Mary Wheelwright period. But as you can see, it's gorgeous. And so during this time period, we also start to have a Dene influence here at the property. So we know of the Pueblo occupation here and the people that established Fioge Pueblo, and that continued to live here and work here throughout the various owners of the property. But during the early 1900s, when Mary Wheelwright is exploring this area, she goes to a powwow in Arizona, and she meets an individual named Justine Claw. And Justine was a Dene leader, a Navajo leader, and a medicine person who was kind of doing a revolutionary thing at the time. They were taking sand paintings, which were temporary things that would be done for a ceremony and then erased at the end of the ceremony. And they were taking those and making them permanent in weavings. And one of the reasons that Justine was an individual that had the ability to do this is we now know that Justine was an intersex individual or a trans individual. And so they had knowledge of both the male and female realms of Dene culture, and were able to move things back and forth in between those. It also meant that Justine had a very well-rounded view of Navajo culture. And so Justine actually approached Mary Wheelwright, who is recorded to not be the friendliest of people to talk to, but Justine had the worry that they hadn't passed on enough knowledge, and that with the Indian schools happening and indigenous students being taken away from their communities and acculturated into American culture, that this knowledge was going to disappear and go away. And so Justine started working for about a decade with Mary Wheelwright, and Justine would come to Los Luceros, and in the hacienda and in the gardens surrounding the hacienda, they would record on wax cylinders stories and chants and songs and just memories of what it was like to live in the Navajo world. And this took many, many forms. They made a They made several books and anthropological papers out of this. And then Mary created a museum with the assistance of lots of other people. And so they started what was first known as the House of Navajo Religion, but then has eventually become known as the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. And so this whole building has a really interesting story as well. And so this is located in Santa Fe on Museum Hill, very close to the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, the Laboratory of Anthropology, and the Museum of International Folk Art. And at the time, she was really one of the only people in Santa Fe that was pushing for a Navajo or Dene representation in the museum and cultural realm there. And so she worked with Justine and several other individuals to design a museum that was based off of a traditional hogan. And when she offered to donate this to Museum Hill, the board of directors refused it. And so, their official reasoning for refusing the donation of this museum and cultural materials was that the architecture of it didn't fit in with the Pueblo revival style of the buildings that were in the area. Mary did not take that very easily. And kind of looking back on those documents, it looks like there was also this idea that maybe the Navajo culture didn't have a place there, and so she helped them fight for that spot, and they eventually get some land donated just on the edge of Museum Hill and get this building constructed. And unfortunately, it opened shortly after Justine passed away, but Justine did bless the land for this museum whenever they began construction. And this museum has always been a very progressive museum as well, in terms of culture and cultural preservation. And they actually returned and repatriated all of the information and all of the materials that were collected by Justine and Mary back to the Navajo Nation. So that's not something that they any longer have. They've returned that. The fear of that being lost is gone, and so it's all been given back now. And during this same time period, when Mary is bringing in these really interesting characters into Los Luceros historic site, she also meets this woman named Maria Chabot. And Maria is my absolute favorite character out of all of Los Luceros historic site history. And I think it's because I relate to her on some levels. But she was kind of a wandering soul. And she was born in San Antonio, Texas. And after she graduated, she just took her graduation money basically and went to Mexico on a trip. And on that trip, she met a woman that named Dorothy Stewart that was an artist and lived partially in Santa Fe. And she traveled the world with Dorothy Stewart. They were actually in a very serious relationship together for a while. And then they lived in Santa Fe together for a while as well. And then when that relationship kind of started to end, Maria was wandering again, and she was looking around for what her next thing was. And she got a job with the Works Progress Administration during the Depression to photograph Spanish colonial furniture in northern New Mexico. In the area, we had a school that was creating a revival of this furniture and teaching local people how to make this Spanish colonial furniture as an art form, as a way to generate revenue for local folk. And so she was going around taking pictures, and that led her to Los Luceros and to the hacienda that Mary Wheelwright owned at the time, because she had an amazing collection of Spanish colonial furniture, as well as Asian furniture and Arabic furniture, African furniture, things that she had brought from all over the world here. And so Maria was here photographing these objects, and she learned that she was actually a distant cousin of Mary Cabot Wheelwright. Chabot is the French version of the Cabot name. And so they kind of had this little connection. And as time goes on, it turns out that Maria comes back as the farm manager for the site. And so she was running the farm for Mary Wheelwright because Mary just wanted to come and look at birds and go on camping trips, and that was kind of it. And she would only come for a couple months a year. But this is some of the most fertile land in all of northern New Mexico. And Maria Chabot saw the potential in that. So she began farming here. And some of the first crops that Maria Chabot put in here at Los Luceros when she became the farm manager um, was cauliflower. And so we have these really interesting oral histories that come from Okeowinge Pueblo of Maria driving her truck to Okeowinge to hire workers from the Pueblo for the day, and they would come out and harvest cauliflower. And it turns out that for about 4 years, Maria and Los Luceros was the main supplier of cauliflower to the entire state of Colorado and New Mexico, which is pretty incredible. But apparently, pretty soon there was a new genetic variety of cauliflower that was available that was harvestable in a much quicker time, which Maria didn't have access to, which kind of made them lose their winning edge on the cauliflower industry at the time. But she went on to try lots of other experimental things, orchards, beans, chili, corn. She planted a lot of things and really enjoyed the agricultural component of that. She also becomes very good friends with Georgia O'Keeffe, and they actually meet in the dining room of the hacienda at a lunch party with Mary Wheelwright, and Maria Chabot goes on to to build and design the home that Georgia O'Keeffe has in Abiquiu. And Maria was living here at Los Luceros while she did all of that work. There's also a lot of really lovely letters that go between the two of them. And so that past photo you saw of Maria is one of my favorite photos of her, but it's really uncharacteristic of her. This photograph of her on a tractor in kind of taming the wilds of Los Luceros, which needs to be done every couple of weeks because things grow so well here. This is really more characteristic of the time that she spent here. And after Mary Wheelwright passed away, Mary actually left the majority of the property to Maria Chabot. And so the guest house that's here is the house that Maria lived in for the several decades that she was here at the site. And then after Mary had passed, she continued to live there. She wasn't a big fan of staying in the big hacienda. And then, it becomes a little bit much for her. And so she starts, trying to sell the property and trying to do something else. She's really a wanderer at heart. And so she's looking for the next thing. And that's whenever the Colliers come in. So Nina and Charles and their daughter still lives here in the area, Lucy, and she still visits us regularly. In fact, she came out to the site yesterday to visit her mother's grave. So Nina Collier was so in love with this property that she chose to be buried here behind the Capilla. And so the Colliers had a huge impact here on the property and helped maintain it for quite a while. The property changed hands many times after the Colliers owned it, and the kind of hand changing increased exponentially as we get closer to modern times. But the next people that bought it that really did anything with the property were Anne and Frank Cabot. So these are more cousins of Mary Wheelwright who were known for gardening. And they had developed garden clubs and developed some really prestigious gardens in historic places throughout the country. And so they purchased the property in 1999, and they start developing it. And so a lot of the crabapple trees that we have and a lot of the flowers that we have around the property are thanks to Anne and Frank Cabot. And then they also created the Los Luceros Foundation, which raised the money to really preserve the buildings as you see them today. So once we're open again and you're able to come visit Los Luceros, the reason that these buildings are still standing and in the condition that they are is thanks to Anne and Frank Cabot kind of trying to, carry on the legacy of their cousin, and then just, promote this beautiful, beautiful place. And so there's a few things from Frank and Anne that we have to do, and that was a condition of the state purchasing the property. And some of that includes specific flowers that we have to plant around the area. And so as the site becomes more established, those are definitely things that we're working towards. And really nice to have an objective that's more than just keep the doors open. We also get to beautify the site and preserve the culture. And so after the or during the Los Luceros foundation period, and the site starts to be considered to be purchased by the state, and it's really seen as a cultural resource that needs to be protected and preserved. In the 1970s and 80s, the property gets listed on the National Registry of Historic Places as well as the State Register of Cultural Places, and they start to see really the depth of the history that's associated with this place. And so there's actually 2 times in the last 2 decades that the state of New Mexico tried to purchase the property and tried to create a bill to purchase this place. And it didn't really happen. It wasn't until the Bill Richardson administration that the site was able to be purchased. And this is just over a decade ago. And so it was bought and kind of given in trust to the Department of Cultural Affairs to manage, but it wasn't designated as a state historic site or a monument or anything like that. It was just being maintained as is. And so for about a decade, not much was really going on here with this property. And there wasn't really funding associated with it other than like a caretaker and basic maintenance. But then on March 28th, 2019, a bill that was sponsored by our Richard Martinez. He sponsored this bill, which added Los Luceros as the 8th state historic site or monument. It's the monument system. The name was changed, but it's the same type of designation. And so thanks to him for sponsoring that bill, it ensures that Los Luceros historic site will be preserved in perpetuity, and it ensures a budget here for staff to not only preserve and protect this place, but also to share it with the public. And so this kind of enters our next chapter. So Michelle Lujan Grisham signed that into law, and it enters us into this next chapter where we get to like throw the doors open and we get to invite the community in. Of course, after the COVID restrictions have been lifted. So Los Luceros today is becoming a place for our communities. Notice I didn't just say community. We acknowledge that here in northern New Mexico, we serve many diverse communities, and we want to be a place where all of those communities can see themselves here and feel comfortable here, whether that's indigenous communities, Hispanic communities, Genesero communities, or even the LGBTQ community. And we're also a place to preserve history. So moving forward, just in the last several months, we've already applied to multiple grants, one potentially even amounting to over $1 million in terms of preservation for the structures here. We also have a big interest in conducting more archaeological research. There has been small archaeology projects that have happened throughout the property, but never a large overarching study, systematic study. So that's one of our main goals that's coming up as well in the coming years. And then a place to celebrate our cultures. And so this photograph is from our Fall Harvest Festival last year, and special thanks to Moving Arts Española. We partner every year and they provide us with some beautiful entertainment. And so, we want a place where these kinds of cultural activities can continue to happen. We've got a commercial kitchen. We're hoping to do food workshops. We have fields that we hope to lease out to local farmers. And we were scheduled this year to start our first farmers market to sell local produce and products from local people. Unfortunately, that might be postponed until next year. But again, we want this to be a place for everyone and to preserve our cultures and our history. And so really, we're for everybody. And this is a photograph of the hacienda from the sheep field. And so in addition to orchards and historic buildings and crops and nature trails and river access, we also have live animals here at the site. And as an archaeologist in the past, I have kind of laughed at the sites that have live animals. But after being here for the last several months since last fall, I've kind of fallen in love with these guys. We've even bottle fed some of them, and so this is something that I think really adds to the historic site, and that we'll probably continue doing and increasing the number of live animals that we have here as well. All right, so whew, I hope you guys were able to handle that. That was a really, really fast run through almost 800 years of human history here at Los Luceros Historic Site. And really what I hope it was doing was to kind of disband some of the myths that were surrounding the site, but B, pique your interest in this place. And we're going to be continuing to do research. We have Carly Stewart and Rebecca Ward, who are two of our interpretive staff members that have been spending this entire shutdown doing research and preparing interpretive programs to share with people for once we open up again. And so I hope this just wets your whistle and that you guys will want to come out and learn more about the site when we reopen, and follow us on Facebook to see the other types of virtual programs that we put together. So now I'll go ahead and take a look and see. Doesn't look like we have, let's see. We'll see if we have any questions. Oh yeah, and I was reminded, and thank you to our cabinet secretary, Deborah Garcia y Griego. So she actually helped push that bill through the legislature as well. And she has been a huge support for Los Luceros Historic Site. In fact, a few weeks ago, some of the local people may have heard, we had a fire scare where a bosque fire, a fire in the forest around the river, actually came up to our property line. And so we had assembled, the staff that we could to remove artifacts and actually evacuate all of the animals from the property in case the fire came on. Fortunately, it didn't. But Cabinet Secretary Deborah Garcia y Griego, she was actually here on the ground helping us load animals into trailers, helping us pack up the priceless artifacts to save them. And so, I'm very thankful to her, Patrick Moore, and Christine Navarro for helping with that project. And so we have a great administration. I couldn't ask for any better leaders in our department. All right. So just kind of looking through for some more questions. Some comments about people falling in love with the site and coming to the Fall Harvest Festival. So somebody was asking if the portrait by Mary Wheelwright that's in the hacienda is the original. So it is an interesting bit of art history. We actually have two replicas here at the site. The original is actually housed in a collections facility in the East Coast somewhere. I'll look that up and double check it after the presentation, and I'll respond to your comment with which institution houses that. So someone was asking if I could speak more about the Pueblo period. And so we actually did talk quite a bit about the Archaic and Fioge Pueblo period. Of course, Los Luceros sits on traditional Tewa lands, and that's a part of the story that hadn't been told much in the past here. And we're hoping to make that a much bigger part of our story moving forward. And so when we reopen, we have several plans to have more programs that focus on that very, very important and kind of founding aspect of our site's history. Okay, so another question, is there Friends of Los Luceros? So actually, yes, we do have a friends group. It's called the Amigos del Rancho Los Luceros. And I can add in the description of this after the presentation a link to their website. They just started accepting membership before the COVID closure, but it is an organization that will be continuing. So if you want to support, you can do that. You can also support Los Luceros by going to the Museum of New Mexico Foundation website, and there's a way that you can become a member of them. They also support us, and you can donate specifically to us through their website as well. All right. Lots of comments about the sound at the beginning, but I'm glad we got that figured out. Okay, so it kind of looks like that's the majority of questions. I'll be around and be checking the comments in the bottom. So if people have questions over the next couple of days, we'll try to get that. But thank you so much. And thank you to Mesa Prieta, another one of our local community organizations that we're trying to work with. And so actually to continue answering the question about talking more about the Pueblo history of the site and of the area, we will be having another lecture coming up soon, and I don't see my notes for it, but we have another lecture that will be coming up very soon, and it will be specifically on the history of Fiogue Pueblo and the oral histories tied to that, and that's going to be, it's actually by Art Cruz, and he's a member of Okeowinge Pueblo. So an indigenous perspective on the Pueblo history of the area, which we're all really looking forward to. So thank you again. I really appreciate all of you watching. And when we reopen, keep an eye on our website. We'll be posting information as it becomes available. But we'd love to see you at Los Luceros Historic Site, and keep following us here on Facebook and on nmhistoricscites.org to see all of the neat virtual programming that we're doing during the COVID closure. Great, thank you, and have a good night.